Just a quick comment on the assisted dying bill that has passed through Parliament and now only faces scrutiny from the Lords. I'm not going to go into all the details. I think anyone who's been following it, if they are honest with themselves, knows it's going to be very loosely regulated and is definitely going to be a slippery slope. Probably doesn't even need to be a slippery slope because of how broadly it can be applied, but I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I just want to talk. Obviously, this is on this channel. I try to get to the essence of why things are happening in terms of capitalist economics and the needs of capital. Capital is self-expanding value. It needs to keep expanding. It needs to keep accumulating, needs to keep making more profit. And as the system gets older, and accumulation gets steeper, the accumulation of capital gets steeper, like climbing a steeper and steeper hill or mountain, it gets more difficult. So I think people look at things like this, where we see a lot of people in this country see stuff like this, where they see in this picture one cycle of chemotherapy costs £4,000, whereas the cost of assisted suicide would be £183. So people look at this and think the government is trying to save money, because what we tend to do in this country is we tend to separate the government from the private sector. So we've got the public sector, which is the government-run part of the economy, and we've got the private sector, which is the privately owned part of the economy. But in Britain, virtually everything has been privatised. There's very, very little in the British economy that is publicly owned anymore. So even the public sector is a bit of a misleading term. The NHS is increasingly privatised. The NHS has always been a subsidy for the private sector because the NHS has to buy its equipment and its medicine from the private sector. So in a capitalist economy, the public sector always serves the private sector, serves as a subsidy for the private sector, where it does things that the private sector can't afford to do, or it raises taxes for the private sector. Everything the state does and spends is a subsidy for the private sector. So welfare is a subsidy. You know, always hearing right-wingers complain about welfare rising and rising, but what happens is capitalism can't afford, capital and the private sector can't afford to employ people to an increasing degree, so the state steps in to provide some welfare for those people to keep them alive so that capital can re-employ them at some stage. And the reserve army of labour also serves capital by reducing the bargaining power of the employed. And then the state spending gets out of control and the debt goes crazy. So the government cuts the amount of money it spends per person on welfare, but the overall welfare bill rises because there tends to be more people out of work or underemployed. And that's illustrated by the high rates of economic inactivity and the record high rate of in-work poverty in Britain at the moment. So people look at this sort of chart and think, oh, it's a callous government, which it is, but it's a callous capitalist government. In a capitalist state, the government is serving the private sector. That's what it does. And the private sector has a big problem, which I'm going to show you. If you haven't, obviously on my channel, I've talked about surplus capital a lot. And this is the problem that capitalism has. In this graph from the Federal Reserve, we can see that money market funds rise before every recession. So you can see that in 1990, 2000, it gets even higher, goes down a bit because of the recession, devalues capital, and therefore enables some of this surplus capital to be reinvested in productive commodity producing activity. But then there's less profit per commodity because of the expansion and innovation and acceleration of productivity. So the cycle repeats to an ever greater degree, again around 2008. Then it rises again enormously to the point where we had a recession at the end of 2019, start of 2020. Same pattern again, and now it's at a record high of $7 trillion or so. So this creates a problem for capitalism. You've got money capital sitting on the sidelines, uninvestable because it's unprofitable to invest it. It's as simple as that. So while some people might have a genuine belief that assisted dying might be valid and ethical and the right thing to do in very certain circumstances, I think this position is only potentially feasibly ethical in an advanced communist society for a number of reasons that I don't really want to go into, but advanced in all senses of the word. So I don't think it's even a good idea for an early stage communist society to really pursue, probably. Not that, some communist dictator is going to decide whether it is or not. But for capitalism, not only is it a slippery slope on its own terms in terms of the way it's been implemented, but even if it had been implemented more rigorously, I would still say it's an extremely slippery slope, because with this rise in surplus capital, alongside it arises surplus labour that can't be employed. So you've got surplus capital, it's unprofitable to invest, which means it's also unprofitable to invest it in labour as well as in capital. And as the system gets more and more automated, this problem is getting worse and worse, more acute. So capitalists, therefore, are left with this dilemma as to how to get surplus capital back into productive investment. So part of what it does is it privatizes anything that's publicly owned or serves the public. And part of that is privatizing public funds, which is an automatic byproduct of privatizing public services. So anything that gets privatized, any funds that get privatized are then redirected into the private sector, because production is becoming so unprofitable, the private sector becomes more and more dependent on the state and on the public. So it's more and more dependent on taxes and fines or whatever, any way of raising money to redirect into the pockets of capitalists and capitalist firms to offset the falling rate of profit and to boost the bottom line, basically. So obviously what happens with austerity is it's not, we hear from social democrats on the left that austerity is a political choice, but it's not. It's for capital, it's an absolute economic necessity. So welfare gets cut. It gets privatized and it gets cut, because what happens is you're privatizing public funds. So corporations need tax cuts so that they are less burdened by taxes, so that money, instead of going to the public, can be used for productive activity to try and offset this problem of falling profit rates and surplus capital. So welfare is being cut more and more with every crisis, with every recession, and then this is just extending itself into this logic of, allowing assisted dying. And, I think the slippery slope is that it's going to be encouraged more and more because they want to cut the welfare bill. Because what happens with a rise in surplus capital and the rising difficulty of expanding value, of accumulating capital, what happens is that capitalist competition intensifies. So that makes it harder to make a profit because you're butting up against capitalist rivals who are competing for the same turf, the same dwindling profits. And the other thing is to get economic growth going, to get capital accumulation going to the sufficient rate, they need to speed up production. So both of these things, competition and the need to speed up production to create more and more value than ever before, to meet the sort of demands of this steepening accumulation of capital, it demands innovation, and the contemporary form of innovation is obviously AI, automation, digitalization. They all of these things fall under the umbrella of automation, which means it's becoming less and less profitable to invest in labor. So what happens is the composition of capital as capitalism ages tends to change in the direction of becoming more and more capital biased. So the ratio of labor to capital tends to fall, and that means that there's less labor time being exploited and turned into profit, which is why there's less profit per commodity, and so on and so forth. So the initial outlay on innovation and automation re-widens profit margins because the outlay on labor falls, and the use of automation is obviously cheaper in the long run because you don't need to pay robots, you don't need to give them sick pay, they don't take breaks, they don't even need bathroom breaks or lunch breaks. So they're far more productive. They work at a higher pace anyway, but there's less labor time and therefore less profit per commodity. And in the long run, that produces a falling rate of profit. Devaluation leads to a falling rate of profit, and the cycle goes on, and you get an underproduction of value and an overaccumulation of capital, this surplus capital that can't be reinvested. So labor is less and less profitable. So investment in labor is therefore declining, and this is the same reason that birth rates are falling. There's less investment in human labor, and that's why birth rates are falling so dramatically. I haven't seen anyone say this anywhere. So many theories going around about why birth rates are falling, but this is the essential reason. All the other reasons that people are pointing to are symptomatic. I'm going to do a separate video on that and go into a lot more detail, but this is also why immigration is skyrocketing. If you can't afford to invest in labor domestically, it's cheaper to invest in labor in countries where capitalism is less developed and to import them here like any other commodity. Like with deindustrialization, when we saw factories basically abandoned domestically and set up instead overseas, where the composition was lower and therefore it was cheaper to produce commodities and ship them back here. So the exact same logic applies to the commodity that is labor power, the ability to work. So as I say, most people seem to understand that the assisted dying bill is bad. They seem to understand this intuitively because they kind of say stuff like they want to replace controllers with AI. So they're bringing in assisted dying, but without the proper understanding of capitalist economics, i.e. Marxism, they seem to usually seek old, as in, and unfortunately anti-communist solutions that just do not work anymore because automation is making capitalism obsolete. And the difference between capitalism with contemporary innovation, i.e. automation, and socialism, which is a publicly owned economy, is that where capitalism increasingly invests in automation and increasingly less in human labor, socialism rebalances that. It still continues to invest in automation, but it also equally invests in human beings and uses automation to improve the livelihoods of human beings because it doesn't suffer from falling profit rates or surplus capital. It's unburdened from the profit necessity, from the effects of commodification which warp society so very badly.